Good afternoon, meteorologist Mike Linden here. I'm joined by tropical weather expert Dr. David Ryglicki. We have new information on Major Hurricane Ian as this storm is really starting to pick up some juice here as it works its way into the incredibly warm waters of the Gulf of Mexico. We will get to Dr. David in just a moment. We're going to jump right into the My Radar app. And of course, now with the hurricane clearing Cuba, working its way into the Gulf of Mexico, we actually were able to see an entire view of the storm here with the National Weather Service radar there in Key West. And you can see a very clearly defined eye here as it begins to track its way northward. But I'm going to tap on the storm. Again, as it stands right now, it is a major hurricane, that being a Category 3 and above, wind speeds at 125 miles per hour. And really, things are anticipated to get rather interesting here over the next couple of days. With this hurricane working its way northward into those very warm waters, hitting Category 4 here potentially very soon. Now, in the latest track from the National Hurricane Center, if I zoom in here, you can see that they have shifted it pretty dramatically. No longer heading into Tampa Bay. In fact, all the way as far south as Venice, Florida here. That's just to the northwest of Fort Myers, to the south of Sarasota, making landfall potentially as a major hurricane, that being a Cat 3. As it works its way inland towards central Florida, now folks in Lakeland could be dealing with a Category 1 hurricane, again, as this pushes its way inland. As we continue to work our way northward here, tropical storm, weakening to a tropical storm there just to the west of Orlando, Florida, continuing to track its way northward through Daytona Beach, Jacksonville and Duval County, and all the way into Savannah, Georgia. And look at that, again, still maintaining tropical storm classification at that point. Again, the winds are certainly one factor here, but boy, the rain going to be yet another. Bear in mind the storm surge too. Now, I want to bring in Dr. David Ryglicki, who has the water vapor imagery pulled up there. And this is a really rapidly developing situation here. And we were just chatting before we ended up going live here with wind speeds. Again, it's easy to get hung up into that, right? You know, when you're talking about a landfalling major hurricane, but just the sheer amount of rain that this storm is going to be bringing, it's definitely something that grabs your attention.
Yes, absolutely. And we can sort of start to see this with the water vapor imagery. And the reason I want to show you the water vapor imagery is that I'm sure, as we were talking about, you see satellite imagery of Ian coming off Cuba right here. But if we look at the water vapor imagery, Ian's outflow is stretching all the way up to Canada. So this is actually a storm with significant impacts beyond just the inner core of the storm. And what I want to focus on here is this patch of clouds right here. So here in central and southern Florida, we're already being inundated with rain. And you can see this really, really clearly on water vapor. Now, the other thing that we want to be aware of is, as Mike, as you talked about, that this storm is going to be weakening because the shear is going to be ramping up. We can also start to see this on the water vapor imagery, is that starting way up here in Canada, we have a ridge, and then a trough is digging into the Gulf of Mexico. And it has actually, for the forecast uncertainties, it has been the evolution of this trough that has been causing a lot of the uncertainties with Hurricane Ian's track. And this trough actually was affected by Hurricane Fiona. So there's a lot of moving parts here, but and I know storm surge is a big thing and wind speeds are a big thing, but we cannot discount rainfall, because rainfall is what usually leads to most fatalities, and we're looking at something like 1 to 2 feet of rain up and down the Florida Peninsula associated with Ian.
David, not to mention that we are dealing with a tornado threat right now across South Florida here. If we jump into the app, Matt, if you want to take this, I'm going to turn off the radar imagery just for a moment here. And this yellow color here, that is a tornado watch. Of course, we've talked in the past couple of days, the right front quadrant of the hurricane is typically, or a tropical cyclone, I should say, is typically where you find tornadic activity. And go figure that the National Weather Service is really picking up on that. We actually have storm chaser Aaron Jack as well as meteorologist Matthew Capucci on the way to South Florida. So we, into the evening hours and over the next few days, we'll have live coverage in the field. So stay tuned for that. But again, a tornado threat for the Florida Keys all the way northward into West Palm Beach. That said, though, if we move to the west coast of Florida here, over the Florida Keys and on Key West, if I tap on it there, a tropical storm warning in place. But then as we start to head up towards Naples, Fort Myers, Tampa, St. Pete, we tap on that pink color, and that is a hurricane warning in effect, ongoing as Ian works its way northward. Let alone those 25 to 30 foot seas. Again, incredibly strong winds working their way inland. Again, that extends all the way northward up near Tampa, St. Pete, and then just above that line there as you head towards Spring Hill, Cedar Key. That is where you start to see the tropical storm warning and a hurricane watch. But again, the hurricane warning, that being the most imminent threat, is just off the coast of Tampa. It seems to be that this is where, and if I go to the layers menu in the app and turn on the hurricane tracker layer, this is where you are seeing the National Hurricane Center, the best of the best when it comes to tropical meteorology, really starting to key in here and hone in on the track. David, it's been really interesting here over the past couple of days that we've seen the NHC continuing to take this track farther and farther to the east, kind of really hard hooking into the state of Florida. You talked before again about this trough. I'm going to turn on the layers on the fronts layer in the app here. Look at that cold front, folks. I mean, that is kind of nudging this storm as it begins to curve its way eastward into the state of Florida. So, David, you of course used to work at the National Hurricane Center. I'm curious as to what's going into how this path is being put together, why we're seeing such big shifts inland here. I mean, it wasn't too long ago, earlier this morning, that we saw the update from the NHC where this storm was going right up and into Tampa Bay. Now, again, if we're looking at kind of a better case scenario here, it's coming more south and to the east now instead of going more north and to the west above Tampa Bay. But now we're really starting to see that path begin to narrow in. So I'm curious, what's going through the minds of the folks at the NHC when they're starting to put this path together and looking at the same data that you're looking at as well?
Well, I also like to emphasize that at the National Hurricane Center, the first and foremost mission of NOAA and the Hurricane Center is the safety of the population, okay? So when they do that, this is first and foremost what's on their mind, is make sure that everyone gets the important information they need to make the best decisions they can to stay safe. Now, in this particular case, why did it all of a sudden dive to the east? And the answer is actually has partly to do with Cuba, is that as Ian was crossing, well, to step back a couple bit, we thought collectively that Ian was going to weaken as it crossed over land, crossed over Cuba, because that's usually what happens. The islands in the Caribbean Sea are generally pretty mountainous, and hurricanes, they don't like that. But this Ian actually managed to cross over, I think, the narrowest width of Cuba, and it didn't decay. What it did do is deflect ever so slightly to the right. Now, is this due to terrain? There are going to have to be some post-analysis studies, probably in academia, to determine if the terrain actually was the really important factor here. But that little jog, it was only a couple of nautical miles, maybe 10, 20 nautical miles. That little jog to the right has completely shifted the track away from Tampa. And this happens sometimes when you have models initializing with old information, because models don't always get the most recent information because they have to do a data assimilation cycle that stretches across hours and hours and hours. So they try to use the best guess, but something short fuse like this, particularly now that this hurricane is coming into radar focus, the Hurricane Center can make these snap decisions and snap judgments to give all of us the best forecast that they possibly can to keep us safe.
David, I want to jump to this high-resolution satellite imagery here, and I believe that where you are here in the studio that you're able to see this. I mean, it's really staggering here. In fact, let me jump back before we get to that. Let's look at the visible satellite imagery here. I mean, as you mentioned, it is now moved off of the coast of Cuba here, and boy, you're really starting to see that stadium effect here in the deepening eye. You know, of course, you're only really going to see that when you're looking at an incredibly strong tropical cyclone, of course, a Category 3 at this point, a major hurricane. So what's happening within the core of the eye here, within its dynamics? And right there, interestingly, at the end of the satellite loop there, in fact, I'm going to pause it and we're going to bring right to it. I mean, look at all of that wild convection and those towers blowing blowing up out ahead of that eye right here, if you can see my blue pointer. So take me through the dynamics at play here, why we're seeing this eye really starting to strengthen. Again, likely to be a Cat 4 here within the next couple of hours.
So there are multiple things going on, and I've actually brought up a zoomed image from the Cooperative Institute for Research on Atmospheres in, I believe it's University of Colorado State, can't remember which, somewhere in Colorado. But what's going on here is that you have a bunch of things going on. So if we focus in on this really slowly, you're actually going to start to see these things called mesovortices, which are the smaller vortices that live on the inside of the eye wall. As you get down to deep into the eye, you have something called a hub cloud. And then here in the eye wall is where you're going to start seeing some of your impressive convective towers and convective bursts. So again, there's a lot going on here. So if we start with the convective towers, the convective bursts, they are very tiny, small scale, essentially driven by, we're not entirely sure, we think it's due to a little bit due to turbulence, due to just the chaotic nature of the hurricane, is that you get these little fine-grained explosive towers that are only a few miles wide, but sometimes they're a little bit larger, embedded within the deeper secondary circulation of the tropical cyclone. Now, as this mass starts coming up, part of it gets ejected that we saw in the water vapor imagery, will get ejected in what's called the outflow. Part of it will actually come into the eye, and it's that sinking which is what clears out the eye. Now, the sinking doesn't happen all the way down. There's actually low-level vertical motion at very, very low levels of the eye, particularly when you get a storm that's this intense, and that's where you get the hub cloud. So the hub cloud usually lives about a mile off the ocean surface. Now, the other parts, mesovortices and the stadium effect that you talked about. So let's dive into the dynamics here. This is going to be fun. So when it comes to the mesovortices, these little, let's clear this out here for a second. There we go. So as we loop around, you'll start to see, as you pardon me turning around a second, these coherent features that exist on the inner edge of the eye wall. And we're going to get technical here. So what happens is that due to the wind profile in the eye, the winds increase rapidly as you get to the eye wall, and they decrease rapidly as you extend away from the eye wall. And what happens is that due to that very sharp wind speed gradient, it supports something, here it comes, called a vortex Rossby wave. So just like in mid-latitudes where you have a high and a low and a high, those are called Rossby waves that you'd see, that we actually were dealing with right now with the ridge over the west, the trough over the east. But you actually get a much smaller version of that inside the eye and inside the eye wall. And what happens is that if those waves break down, they're in the horizontal plane. So they basically start in the eye, then you get a ridge and a trough existing on the eye wall. And if those break, then you get mesovortices. So that's where these things come from. Now for this, so that's the technical explanation. Like it's really neat, and these have been studied for about 20 years now, 25 years. And we're still trying to figure out what they do. They look cool. They certainly look really neat. We're still trying to figure out what they do. Now as for the stadium effect, this has to do with something called angular momentum, and I go back to like college physics, and it drives me nuts. But what happens is, as the air comes in, it has a certain amount of angular momentum, which is just a measure of the rotational momentum of the storm. But as it goes out, that momentum goes down because it starts spinning down. So to keep all of that consistent, it actually comes in at an inner radius and has to spiral out at a higher radius because the winds go down in order to conserve angular momentum. So, I got a little technical there in the weeds, but hurricanes are really cool, and the dynamics of it are really interesting and really intense. But hey, this is what makes them look the way they do, Mike.
And David, I mean, they may look cool, right, at least looking at them on satellite imagery, but we want to remind folks out there that this needs to be taken very seriously. Right here, just right outside of our studio. In fact, we might even be able to show that tower camera here. Interstate 4, just to the side of our building here, I mean, is totally slammed with people that are trying to get away from the west coast of Florida. This is a part of the state that is not always dealing with something like this. Now, bear in mind, you're seeing a lot of the traffic a bit farther to the south of our office. We'll check back in with that a bit later here, Matt. But I want to remind people that are watching the stream, we're streaming, of course, on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube. We're in the app as well. So if you are watching on YouTube, be sure to subscribe to the channel. It's totally free to do so, and turn those notifications on as well. That way you always know whenever we drop a new video, or of course whenever we go live. I also see you guys watching in the chat here in front of me here. If you have any questions for myself, or with one of the brightest brains in tropical meteorology, that being Dr. David here, get those questions into the chat and we will try our best to answer them here. We've got a lot to prep for as the day rolls on here, so we'll go for just a little bit longer here. Matt, if you want to take that high-resolution satellite imagery here, because I really want to pick David's brain a bit more about what we're seeing here. Again, we have now seen that eye clear Cuba, and I mean, my gosh, as it hits that warm water of the Gulf of Mexico. Again, I'm going to grab my pointer here. We're going to move the eye off of Cuba and just look at that huge swell right there, and you just see just the sheer size of this storm really start to pick up some steam. And then I'm going to jump here to this graphic here, and we're going to clear these away. But I mean, David, you're talking about incredibly, incredibly warm water, particularly in the Gulf of Mexico. I mean, I'm just going to query a couple of these spots here. 89, 90 degrees up near Tampa, where the storm is headed, and up near Sarasota, anywhere between 88 and 90 degrees. What is this doing for the hurricane at large, David, as it works its way close to the western coastline?
Right. So you can think of hurricanes as gigantic heat engines, and what all of this warm water does is it flux moisture and heat off of the ocean as the air comes in as part of the hurricane secondary circulation. As it's coming over the water, it's pulling out, it's evaporation. It's pulling out moisture and heat from the ocean. So by the time it gets to the eye wall, these parcels are very saturated. They have a lot of moisture, they have a lot of heat. So in the inner core, in the eye wall of a hurricane, you get what's called surface convergence. So as all this air starts piling up, well, it can't go inwards anymore, and it can't go down into the ocean, so it goes up. So it's being forced upwards. But as a part of that, as air rises, it also starts to cool. And when air cools, all the water in it starts to condense. And when water changes phase, and this is actually a pretty fundamental concept of the entire atmosphere, is the phase change of water. So when water changes phase, that's when it actually is going to warm that little parcel of air. So these parcels, this is how you get convective towers, are gonna rocket up. So as you get more warm water in, they get driven up a little bit faster. They get driven up even faster than that if the water is warmer, and then you get that sinking in the eye, and that's how you get that engine going. That's how you get this feedback loop. Is that the warm, moist air is brought in, it goes up faster, it sinks faster in the eye. That drops the pressure. Then then it sucks in more air, sucks in warmer air, sucks it in faster, fires it up faster into the eye, and on and on and on. And that's how this rapid intensification most likely took place with Ian, because even before it hit Cuba, you were looking at possibly 90 to 91 degrees Fahrenheit sea surface temperatures to the south of Cuba. And not only that, since we've had an extraordinarily quiet year, the waters have been undisturbed in the Western Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico. So basically, short of the environment slowing this thing, the shear slowing this thing down, the thermodynamic environment is prime, because Ian's the first one to cross all this stuff. So
right.
Mike, it's working with a lot of really, really warm water to basically just go bananas.
Totally. And as we've been chatting here for not too long, now Ian up to 120 miles per hour. That's roughly 10 miles per hour short of becoming a Category 4 hurricane. And just with the way that it is evolving as quickly as it is, not going to be too long before we see that. Matt, if you want to take this graphic in full here before we get to David, we got some great questions in the chat that we're going to get to in a moment. We spoke before about the threat of rainfall. Forget the winds for just a moment. But the rainfall threat, let's jump over to it here before we get to that storm surge graphic. Anywhere where you are seeing a yellow color on this map here, we're talking upwards of 2 feet of rain. I mean, it's a pretty sharp cutoff as well when you go from central Florida there, right around the Kissimmee area there, jumping from 5 to 7 inches of rain to upwards of 2 feet for Orlando, Florida, even as far northward as Jacksonville. So again, with the track changing, you're starting to see additional portions of Florida that are being lumped into this incredibly severe rainfall situation here. Again, that's 2 feet of water falling from the sky, stretching from Tampa Bay all the way to the state line. In fact, some portions of Georgia could be looking at a lot of rainfall upwards again of the 2 feet mark. So that's one thing to keep in mind. Now let's jump over to the storm surge flooding here that could come from Ian. This is a rapidly evolving situation as well. It wasn't too long ago that we were seeing Ian going to the north of Tampa, which was keeping those storm surge, keeping the storm surge forecast a bit on the more bullish side. Now you're starting to see that bullseye starting to move more toward the southeast, toward Marco Island, Fort Myers, Sarasota. Anywhere where you're seeing, let me zoom in here across Key West, where you're seeing yellow or blue, that's 1 to 3 feet, not inches, 1 to 3 feet of storm surge for those locations. Let's move up the west coast here. Again, you start to see some bigger numbers jumping out here. Marco Island, part of this too. Remember, there's causeways to get to some of these portions of Florida. So if you really need to be listening to emergency officials, whether or not you need to be evacuating at this point, you are running out of time in that regard. But if you are a bit more inland and you do not have an evacuation order, you certainly need to be sure that you are preparing to deal with a pretty nasty storm, a lot of rainfall to boot. Again, that red color there, that's upwards of 10 feet of storm surge being pushed inland. Let's keep working our way northward here. Let me zoom back in a little bit. We'll look at Naples here. Again, you can see these inlets. Let me grab my pointer tool here. That water rushing in and working its way here through the inlet. So even though right here along the coast of Naples, you might not see upwards of 10 feet of storm surge, you have the water here sneaking in kind of on the backside here. For folks that live in homes, even in this area here, again, not looking pretty here for at least the current cone of Ian. Let's work a bit far. Oh, got to jump back here. Let's work our way now to what seems to be the jackpot zone, if you will, here. So let me grab my tool here. Starting in Pelican Bay, as we work our way toward Bonita Springs and Fort Myers Beach. Boy, that is a lot of storm surge. Again, that red color represents storm surge of greater than 9 feet, probably going to be closer to 10 when all is said and done. And again, if we look as far inland here, look at all that water sneaking in here. I mean, very likely that you're going to see a lot of these numbers really jump up here as that cone continues to narrow in on where we are likely to see Ian going. Again, intensifying to a Cat 4. Let's work our way northward here toward Port Charlotte. And again, even as far inland as Arcadia, you might be seeing some of that pretty big storm surge. Again, upwards of 9 to 10 feet there. Let's keep working our way up the west coast of Florida. Now, look at Sarasota and look at Tampa. Again, things are improving a little bit for folks there that might have been starting to get a bit nervous. Again, this is one of the fastest growing portions of the United States, let alone Houston, Texas. There are millions of people that have moved to this part of Florida here over recent years that have not dealt with anything like this before. Bear in mind, there hasn't been a landfall in Tampa when you're talking major Category 3 and above since 1921. As it stands right now, based on the current path, it looks like there will not be a landfall there in Tampa. There's still plenty of time for this thing to change. We shall soon see, but an improving situation when it comes to the storm surge for Tampa Bay. Roughly 1 to 3, if not closer to 6 feet of storm surge for those spots. Again, I'm trying to be as optimistic as I can here, folks. But look as far northward, even up near the Big Bend, you're starting to see 1 to 3 feet of storm surge here. And as we advance out here a little bit more, well, you start to see these numbers beginning to creep up a little bit here, up toward Georgia, South Carolina, Charleston, Savannah, and even in Jacksonville here, upwards of near 6 feet of storm surge. So again, David, as we are seeing the NHC beginning to really narrow the path here, I see that you've got the storm surge graphic up there. Again, we're kind of the right mindset here, right? That it's starting to be a bit of a silver lining forecast for Tampa Bay, right? Especially as that storm didn't go more to the north and west. It's starting to come a bit more to the south. So those strongest winds, and therefore that storm surge, looks to be pushing far south. But that means that for spots to the south of Tampa Bay, again, that being the Fort Myers area, could be looking at a lot more storm surge than they were initially anticipating even just a couple of hours ago.
Yeah, no, that jog to the right this morning in Cuba really did change, as we talked about with the track. That really did change a lot of what we're seeing here. Not so much the rainfall, but especially the storm surge. And storm surge, to remind everyone, storm surge is associated with the motion of the storm. So as the hurricane is moving on the right front side, as it's moving, it's quite literally pushing the water up. And that water is being pushed up, and when a hurricane makes landfall, it pushes that water up on shore and does a lot of damage. And just to remind everyone, when it comes to infrastructure damage, that's storm surge. Please get out of the way. If you're close, if you're on shore and a storm surge is coming, it's bad news. This is what all of that major property damage is associated with. That's storm surge. Precipitation is usually associated with fatalities because precipitation is over usually a much larger area, and people don't expect, a hurricane to dump 1 to 2 feet of rain like we're looking at with this one. So, Mike, I think that even though this is better for Tampa, because as you said, landfall in Tampa of this magnitude hasn't happened since the 20s, and Tampa just hasn't had to worry about this kind of hurricane resiliency for quite literally a century. So it's better for Tampa. It's still going to be a rough ride for everyone in this red area here of 8 to 12 foot anticipated storm surge.
So I'm going to take a look at some of the questions here coming in from the chat, David. We've got a lot, and we're starting to really see those numbers grow from people watching across all of the platforms that we are live in. So let's answer some of these questions here. And again, for people that are watching on YouTube, Facebook, you're in the app, wherever you are, ask us a question here in the chat, and we will try our best to answer them. We've got a lot going on here as Ian works its way northward, but we're going to try our best to answer as many of these questions as we can. So let's see here. So here's a question from Facebook here, David. What is the worst side of the storm through Florida? Where are you estimating things to be the worst?
So it's going to be the front and the front right part for two reasons. Storm surge, as I just mentioned, front right is where this is favored. And to give you an extreme example of the opposite, if you remember when, or maybe you don't remember, is when Hurricane Irma made landfall on the southern side. Due to the northerly flow from Irma, because Irma was quite a sizable storm, the water actually went out of Tampa Bay, and people were walking in the bay, and that was interesting but not great. So for the storm surge, it's the front right. Now, after this storm makes landfall, what's going to happen with the storm is that it's going to start to be undergoing vertical wind shear, which we'll talk about in a little bit. That's going to make the storm tilt. That's going to change the thermodynamic characteristics of the storm down tilt, which is down shear. So that's going to promote even more rainfall. So generally speaking, if you're, since this is going to be such a rainmaker, if you're just along that direct track, quadrants aren't going to matter too much. I mean, if it's tilting down shear and it's moving in that direction, there's no way around it. But really the directional part of it is more of a concern for storm surge.
Now, of course, as the saying goes from the National Weather Service, I mean, I would imagine folks have heard this quite often here, and I drew the quadrant there on the storm there. Let me get rid of those. As I'm sure most folks have heard, turn around, don't drown, right? If you are trying to outrun a hurricane, I mean, that's just not a good idea, right? That's why it's key to prepare now before its arrival. It only takes roughly about 6 inches of water to reach the bottom of most passenger cars. Again, we're talking about 10 feet of storm surge here for some locations. So again, 6 inches just to get to the bottom of the car. About a foot of water to lift a car, and that includes most SUVs, trucks, what have you, and roughly 2 feet of water to completely wash it away. Again, that's 2 feet. If I go back to this storm surge graphic here, anywhere where you're seeing yellow, that's representative of 3 feet of storm surge. Again, water that is being wind driven and being pushed inland. So please keep that in mind, that you know, if you come up even to like a flooded roadway here, potentially in the days after Ian, not a good idea to drive through those flooded roadways really ever. As David mentioned before, people wading around in floodwaters. For one, you never know what's going to be in that water, let alone any kind of animals. Bear in mind, you know, there's sewers, right, around most of these municipalities. Things are going to come out of the sewers, so keep that in mind as well. Never a good idea, even for your own health, to not wade through that kind of water here. But again, turn around, don't drown is definitely the rule of thumb when it comes to how to treat the aftermath or even trying to deal with flooded out roadways. David, I have another question in here. People asking, if this reaches the Atlantic, are we likely to see it strengthening as it works its way up the southeastern coastline? I'll pull up the track here for you so we can take a look at that on the app.
Sure, and that actually is part of why the storm surge numbers have started shooting up around Jacksonville all the way up to the middle of South Carolina. So there is the possibility of this storm getting back over the Atlantic Ocean and making a second landfall in the southeastern United States. It's not unheard of for a storm to make landfall, weaken, and then re-intensify, particularly around the Florida Peninsula. Ivan from 2004 was basically a hurricane for like 3 weeks doing something like this. So it's usually at that point is duration over water and how warm the water is. The thing about what's going to be happening with Ian is that the shear numbers are going to be extraordinarily high. And my research has been differentiating between trough shear and ridge shear. Ridge shear, which it endured early on in its life associated with Fiona, isn't as bad as trough shear. Now it's going to be enduring trough shear, and that's going to be less good for it. So the chances of this re-intensifying to anything beyond tropical storm category 1 are generally pretty small. Some models are hinting that it will go back over water, but to expect another redevelopment of a major, that is looking rather unlikely.
All right, so now let's take a look at something that we have yet to show. This is the tropical storm force winds, and this is within the My Radar app here, so I'll show you all how to access these. You need to go to the layers menu. It looks like the stack of cards on the toolbar. Go into the hurricane tracker layer and turn on the wind speed forecast. Just for right now, I'm actually going to turn off the radar so we can get a really close look here. Anywhere where you're seeing that purple color, that is a 90 to 100% probability of those tropical storm force winds. We're talking 45 miles per hour and above. Now, look at the times here. I mean, just 13 minutes ago, we hit this. So folks in Key West are likely dealing with tropical storm force winds. We're going to try to see if we're able to pull up some live cameras from there, but we will continue to work on that. Over the course of the next 6 hours, those tropical storm force winds continue to track their way northward, and then into the overnight hours and into tomorrow. Folks in Fort Myers, Port Charlotte, Sarasota, and St. Petersburg are likely to feel those tropical storm force winds. As we continue to work our way into midweek, again, 24 hours from now, effectively, if not even beyond that, folks in Tampa, Lakeland, Kissimmee, Orlando, Florida, you can see that blue dot on the map right there. That's us. That's the My Radar studio here in Orlando, Florida. Disney World is part of this as well. So for folks that maybe are here on a Disney vacation and Mother Nature was not on your side when it came to timing, just know that you are included in that risk as well. Incredibly strong winds working their way inland throughout the day on Wednesday. You can see Wednesday at 8 a.m. just to the southwest of Tampa St. Pete, and that extends for 12 hours through to Orlando and working its way into the Orlando suburbs there and northward. If I continue to zoom this out a little bit, that darker red color and even that pink color, that's when you start to see spots like Daytona Beach, Deltona, Palm Coast, Jacksonville, and even crossing the border there into Georgia. Over that next 12-hour span, we are likely to see those winds continue to extend inland here. So let me switch back on the radar here. We will turn off the wind speed forecast and go back to the cone. For those of you that are just joining us here, we are, again, watching Hurricane Ian as it works its way northward. Those outer rain bands really starting to push their way northward here into South Florida. Again, a tornado threat. Let me show you guys that here. We'll turn off the hurricane tracker, turn off the radar, and turn on the watches and warnings. That yellow color there, and that is a tornado watch in effect for most of the Florida Keys, including Key Largo, Miami, Fort Lauderdale, the Homestead area. That's just one more thing you got to deal with, right, when you're dealing with tropical cyclones here. And we'll toss it over to David in a moment to break that down. Now, let me turn the radar back on, and we will turn those off, and the hurricane tracker layer once again. Again, those of you that are just joining us, let me turn that opacity up a little bit here. So the expectation, at least as of right now from the National Hurricane Center, is a landfall as a Category 3 hurricane right around tomorrow evening, pretty close to midnight. Not ideal when you are dealing with any kind of severe weather, when you are under the cover of night, whether it be tornadoes, landfalling hurricanes. When you can't see it, that really adds another level of intensity for sure here. So let's take a look at some of these chat questions here, David. We got some folks asking, we got Trent here watching on Facebook, will there be major winds in the Orlando area? So we talked about that a little bit, but maybe you could break that down for us a bit more. Again, these tropical storm force winds extending way far out from the eye wall, but again, you're still going to experience some real nasty winds from Ian, even before it makes landfall for folks in Central Florida.
Right, and there's something we have to talk about when it comes to hurricane intensity. When they actually calculate hurricane intensity, that is sustained, okay? So that is, I believe it's averaged over 3 minutes. It's something like that. It's different from different bases.
Eternity.
What?
In eternity. I mean, 3 minutes with winds that strong, not fun.
Yeah, basically it's like an eternity. And that varies basin to basin. I worked for the Navy for 10 years, so I might be conflating a little bit with the Western Pacific. But regardless, that's what they do, is sustain winds. That doesn't factor in gusts. So even though you may incur sustained winds of hurricane force, 50 to 60 mile per hour, you can still get gusts, it's called a gust factor. And that's usually the ratio of the gust to the base wind. So gust factor is usually 1.3 to 1.4. What that means is that you can experience gusts 30 to 40% higher than what the sustained wind is. So if we do some quick math in our head, if you have a sustained wind of 60 miles per hour, you can experience gusts of 80 to 90. And that's really what's going to get you here, is that if you just get because now we're going to be over land, it's going to get a little turbulent. You're going to get land forcings. If you're in Orlando, as I'm looking outside right now, you have some tall buildings. You're going to get a funneling effect around some of these buildings. So like I said, even though the sustained winds might be 50 to 60 miles per hour, due to these land effects, these funneling effects, you can experience gusts in excess of that as the storm is passing by, Mike. So that's something that we need to convey, is that even though you may think, Category 1, I can handle 50 mile per hour. I don't know who's saying that. If you think that, you also have to factor in there are going to be gusts that are going to have 20 to 30% more wind than the sustained wind.
David, we got a few questions here coming into the chat regarding the track. Before we get to that, I want to show folks in the app once again the wind layer. This is likely to be a really interesting look at Ian as it works its way northward. You have two options in the app here: the winds at the surface and the air upstairs, 500 millibars. That's the jet stream. I like to tell folks, I guess this will date me a little bit here. If you remember the NSYNC music video from back in the day when they were the marionette puppets, right? The jet stream, I see David reacting there. The marionette at the top there, the puppet master, is the one pulling the strings. That's like what the jet stream is, right? It's an incredibly fast, just highway of winds, and that is really going to steer down at the surface because, again, hurricanes are closer to the surface than where the jet stream is here. Look at this. These are the surface winds just off the coast of Cuba. You can really see where it's starting to wrap around the eye. But check this out. I'm going to go back into the layers menu, tap on the winds, and go switch it over to the jet stream here. We've got opacity turned all the way up. We're going with Noah's color scheme here as well. And how about that? Look at the backside of the storm here. Again, this is the jet stream winds, folks. 500 millibars, way, way, way upstairs in the atmosphere here, working to steer Ian right on the path that the NHC has for it right now. So you have the winds, David, at the surface that are agreeing with the winds way up there. Again, this goes to the question in the chat here that we've answered before, but we'll answer it again for folks that are just joining us here. How are the wind patterns affecting this track here, making it go more southern and eastern than where it was just a few hours ago, working its way more northward toward Tampa Bay?
Right. So the whole mystery of this whole track with Ian has been the ridge over the western United States and the trough over the eastern United States. And the question has been, is that trough going to capture Ian? And I don't, maybe I have it. If we have the GFS, sorry, this is the European ensemble, is bringing this inland. So this is most likely is liking a deeper trough to pull Ian into the Florida coast, whereas the GFS is westward. And the GFS, this has been a persistent thing with the GFS, comparing the two models, is that the GFS is building the ridge over Georgia just a little bit stronger. It's kicking that trough out to sea, and it's not quite catching Ian. So, yeah, one of the things I like to say, I actually responded to someone on Twitter about this, is that intensification is largely a local phenomenon. Steering is a hemispheric phenomenon. So to understand where these storms are going, you really need almost an entire hemisphere view of what's controlling steering patterns as it comes out of the tropics. Because, you know, a typhoon in the Western Pacific, as it curves up around Japan, can have ripple effects that extend all the way over the United States, Mike. So that's where a lot of your uncertainty is coming. Is that, I don't want to say, you know, it's not exactly the butterfly effect. A typhoon's not a butterfly, but that's where a lot of the uncertainty coming. It's a couple miles this way. It's a couple miles that way. It's maybe a convective cell a little stronger in one. So there's a lot that goes into figuring out how this pattern is going to set up in the mid latitudes.
Right. It changes the whole ball game. For sure. Now, we have a lot of questions here coming in, David. I've seen a lot of the questions here on YouTube coming in from people asking about Jacksonville, Florida. Now, we showed you before that the expectation for rainfall there is just continuing to rise in terms of what the sheer numbers are going to be. I mean, upwards of near 2 feet of rainfall for Duval County, Jacksonville, and that does cross over the border and heads into Georgia. So break it down for the folks in the chat here, for people that maybe weren't anticipating anything from Ian other than maybe some winds and a few thunderstorms that now are being included in some really big rainfall totals. Again, 2 feet of water falling from the sky, not something to mess around with.
No, and this is, again, goes back to the messaging about from the National Hurricane Center, is that the category is not the whole story. You know, there's a new one for you. Turn around, don't drown. Category is not the whole story. So rainfall is a really serious impact associated with this. And if you think back to what Ian was dealing with, you know, Ian was sheared by the outflow of Fiona going back about a week ago. I feel like the storm has been around for quite a while. But that is what, as Ian started pulling itself together, the flow associated, the primary circulation, the swirling winds, is still picking up pieces of moisture that has been stretched over the Caribbean. Because like I said, you know, the Caribbean has been exceptionally warm. So you just get some air, some convergence, it's going to blow up with convection. So what Ian is doing, it's bringing a lot of moisture from the Caribbean along for the ride. And that's what's going to be dumping all of this rain on top of us. You know, I said in my video that it's usually associated with wind speed. Slower moving ones generally have more rain than faster moving ones. Harvey from 2017 is your big example. But sometimes in cases like this, where shear starts to mess with it when it's very young, you can actually get a much broader wind field and a much broader rain field. And this is a little surprising. Mike.
David, we've got a few folks here in the chat asking about particular locations. Now, there's hundreds of you here in the chat here, so I want to reiterate a really great feature about the app here, and I'm not just trying to sell you on the feature of the app. It is an incredibly useful tool for situations such as this, particularly if you were to lose power where you live. As long as your cell phone is charged up and you have cellular connectivity, you can still see where the storm is, all of the big factors at play, and you can even track power outages too, as we'll do in just a moment. But someone here is asking in the chat about Palmetto, Florida. So here on the iPad app, I can tap on the magnifying glass. We're going to type in Palmetto, Florida. Zoom in a little bit here. In fact, I will do that once again so you guys can see it here. Palmetto, Florida. And again, that's keying in there right around the Sarasota area. So David, what would be your personalized forecast for the person there that says they have a boat there?
How attached are you to that boat? Because if you have
that's a real concern, right, for a lot of people that live on the west coast of Florida.
Right, and what's probably going to happen is that it's going to get beached. I know when I worked for the Navy, this was a big concern with landfalling hurricanes and typhoons. So, 2 or 3 days out, they would actually take the ships out of port and go loiter offshore and wait for the hurricane to pass. If your ships and boats are moored in the pathway of this thing, they're probably going to wind up in, unfortunately, somebody's living room.
I'm going to go back here on our Twitter feed, David. I want to pull it up from earlier today. We have a view from space of this thing. Here it is. The ISS was able to capture Ian from space. Matt, I think you can see this here. Let me take it in full. There it is. I mean, look at that, David. I mean, Mother Nature, is certainly very fickle, right? But like, holy moly, look at that view there as this storm works its way northward. Again, only going to see it become stronger here over the coming hours. We've been chatting here, David, for about 45 minutes or so, and we've already seen it beginning to tick up and tick up and tick up. Again, for the folks that live along the west coast of Florida, time is really running out. For people that live right on the coast of Florida, very likely you've been told to evacuate, and you should absolutely be paying attention to local emergency management officials and listening to them in terms of where to go and when to leave. I don't think we necessarily have any here just yet, but just in case here, if folks don't know, a feature in the My Radar app is the new power outages layer. And you can turn that on and it will show you power outages in your area. And as it stands right now, and I guess this is certainly a good sign with a lot of these municipalities putting power lines underground for instances exactly like this, David, we are not seeing any power outages that have been tracked across South Florida here just yet. When, remember, there is that tornado watch in effect for South Florida. In fact, I'm going to turn on the outlook from the Storm Prediction Center here. We have not talked about this here just yet. That yellow color, let alone the tornado watch, which is in effect for the Miami, Fort Lauderdale, Homestead area, there is a slight risk for severe weather today. That's a 2 out of 5 in the Storm Prediction Center scale. Orlando, where we are right now, David, as well as Central Florida, that's stripped right across I-4 and toward the Space Coast and Titusville, under a marginal risk for severe weather. We will likely see this tick up as well, folks, as we head into tomorrow. Why is it that we are dealing with a tornado threat here out ahead of the hurricane as it works its way toward the West Coast?
So tornadoes associated with hurricanes are usually associated with a hurricane that's undergoing vertical wind shear, because when it tilts, it changes the thermodynamics. In this case, what you're actually getting is from the rain bands. Now, the rain bands actually structurally, if you start breaking them down and look at the dynamics and thermodynamics, they're actually considerably different than the eye wall. They're actually quite different phenomenologically. There's a $5 word for you. But part of the rain bands is that since the physics and the dynamics of their generation are a little different, they can be more prone to tornadoes far away from the core. So what's going to be happening here is that as you start getting tornado genesis, conditions favorable for tornadoes, these cells that are coming along onshore, because really, when you think about what tornadoes like, why you get so many in the Central Plains, is because there aren't too many trees. It's generally flat. And for those of you who haven't been in southern Florida, like, it's the Everglades. Like, it's flat. So there's not a lot of tree cover or mountains or hills to really disrupt a lot of the low-level dynamics that is necessary for tornadoes. And again, I think just due to this peculiarity of how Ian is pulling up all of this unstable air and moisture on its eastern and northeastern side, that's why it's setting a stage for tornado genesis, or potential tornado genesis, excuse me, Mike.
David, something that we have not looked at here that I know you have that you're probably pretty pumped to see here. This is the velocity scan here of Hurricane Ian as it works its way northward here. Of course, when we're looking at a velocity image here, green representing winds going toward the radar site, winds going away from it are represented in the red. And of course, you see those values even higher when you start to see those oranges, blues, and purples here. So David, we're looking at Ian here on the velocity scan, courtesy of the radar there in Key West. What are we seing here?
Well, you have to remember, right. So what you have to remember is that we have, this is beam curving. So as this is basically at this point, since Ian is just coming off Cuba, it's basically at the farthest extent of the radar, and I believe that's about 2 miles up for the base scan, 2 to 3 miles up for the base scan. So what the scan is actually seeing are winds at 2 to 3 kilometers. 2 to 3 miles above the surface of the ocean, excuse me. So that's what we're seeing, is that as the storm gets closer, we will start to see winds closer to theirs. Now, the thing about hurricanes, which makes them unusual relative to what you see from like a mid-latitude trough, is that the hurricane's strongest winds are at the surface. So as the hurricane starts coming closer and that beam starts intercepting scattering particles that are closer to the surface, you're going to start to see these winds tick up. So the fact that you're seeing the blues and the browns and the yellows already means that those strong winds have extended up to about 2 to 3 miles in the storm. And Mike, as it gets closer, that's where you're really going to start to see some of the more intense winds focused around the core.
I keep jumping around here in the app, and it's pulling in a ton of data, so we'll just let that load here for a moment. So, folks, we've been going now for almost an hour here. We're probably going to wrap things up here soon. So if you have any questions for Dr. David, get those questions in now. Again, Dr. Hurricane, that might as well be his nickname here. He certainly knows all about tropical cyclones. So if you have any questions about the larger dynamics at play or anything that's going on here, get those questions in now. So let me reiterate one more time here for folks that are just joining us in the chat. I'm going to go back to the reflectivity, and we'll turn on the hurricane tracker layer so we can take a look at that path. I'll tap on Hurricane Ian here. Right now, Ian is a major hurricane. That's Category 3 and above, with wind speeds as it stands right now at 120 miles per hour. I believe not too long ago I saw that this whole storm is about 10 miles wide. That's quite large, folks. It's about 265 miles south of Sarasota right now as we speak. And if we zoom in a little bit here, again, you can see that the expectation by midnight tonight from the National Hurricane Center is for this storm to intensify to a Category 4 storm. That is where we're looking at wind speeds between 130 and 156 miles per hour. That does not necessarily mean that's what you're going to see at landfall, because the expectation is, again, from the NHC, that we will see some weakening occurring as this storm approaches the coastline there. But don't get caught up within that kind of classification. Even though this says here a Cat 3 by late tomorrow evening for folks that live in Venice, Englewood, Port Charlotte, or Northport there, just to the northwest of Fort Myers. Don't get caught up in the fact that you're seeing Cat 3 there. You just need to be prepared for a lot of wind, a lot of storm surge, and a lot of heavy rain coming your way. We, again, have seen this track shift dramatically to the south over these last couple of days. It wasn't too long ago, David, that we saw this track going really far northward, up near Cedar Key. In fact, some of those ensemble models that you brought up before had this storm a couple of days ago going right up into the Panhandle. So for interests in the larger Gulf Coast states, we're looking at Mobile, up near Destin, Florida, and even into New Orleans. We're all kind of on pins and needles there, really waiting to see where this track was going to go. But we have seen it work its way more south and more east over these past couple of days. Tampa and Tampa Bay, at least, not likely at this point to take that direct landfall, but boy, David, is it going to be really close there. Potentially, again, as a Cat 3 just to the south of Sarasota there and to the north of Fort Myers. That seems to be kind of the zone that the NHC is beginning to key in on here. As it works its way inland, the expectation is for it to continue to weaken. Of course, it's not over water at that point, to a Category 1 hurricane, working its way through Lakeland, Florida, and up toward Disney World and Kissimmee as a weakening storm, and still at that point a tropical storm, right on through Orlando, Florida, where the MyRadar headquarters is. And as we continue to see this thing work its way northward, kind of paralleling I-4 there, up through the main artery of the state, Daytona Beach, Palm Beach, St. Augustine, Jacksonville, Florida, even as far northward as Savannah, Georgia, and almost up near Augusta, Georgia, maintaining tropical storm force strength until it eventually begins to die down to a tropical depression as far north as South Carolina, maybe even working its way, David, into Charlotte at that point as a tropical depression. So still maintaining a lot of juice here. So let's look back here at the chat here, and then I think we're going to start to wrap some things up here. Here's a question for you, David. So what's going on with the hurricane hunters right now? I'm seeing a lot of people asking about the recon data. What are the hurricane hunters, those brave men and women that are flying into the heart of the storm? What's going through their minds right now, and what are they looking to find when they work their way into Ian?
Okay, so to clarify, well, actually, it's a fun little anecdote. I've been on the NOAA Hurricane Hunters. I flew into the eye of, I do believe, Hurricane Michael back in 2018.
So roller coasters are just not a thing. Thrill rides are just not a thing for you. That's the ultimate thrill ride right there.
Yeah, basically, when people ask me how did it experience, it was basically the best day of my professional life, and I usually ask them, how do you feel about roller coasters? And if you don't immediately say, I love roller coasters, don't get on that plane ever, because it's one of the most. It was 0 G's at one point going down, 3 G's at one point going up. There was only one guy threw up. I kept my barf bag. It's clear. I've kept it since then. I have proof. It wasn't me. But so there are 2 hurricane hunters. There's the Air Force Reserve out of Mississippi, and then there's the NOAA Hurricane Hunters, which are actually out of Lakeland. And I didn't check before the call. They are probably going to evacuate to a forward operating base somewhere else to avoid the storm if it is indeed going over Lakeland. So what the hurricane hunters now are doing are what are called center fixes. So the most important thing, on the Air Force planes, they have what's called the SMRF, the Step Frequency Microwave Radiometer. That allows them, it shoots down from the belly of the plane, and that allows them to measure wind speeds over the ocean, dealing with precipitation and stuff like that. But what also the plane is doing is that once it gets into the eye, it's trying to find the minimum winds to figure out exactly where the center is. So now, one of the things I actually wanted to bring up was that now that the Hurricane Center is undergoing landfall operations. So you should be seeing position updates every hour because it's within radar. The aircraft will corroborate that, and you'll see the updates come every 3 hours opposed to every 6. Now, the NOAA Hurricane Hunters, there are 3 NOAA Hurricane Hunters. There are 2 WP3D Orions from the 60s. They have the instruments. They have what's called a tail Doppler radar. So what the tail Doppler radar does is just like when you have radar on the ground, as we were showing in the app, that allows us to look at the hurricane, like a normal radar. These planes have radar that, as the plane's flying, it actually does a pattern like this. And through all of their really awesome processing, you can actually get a full 3D view of the hurricane. And this gives you a lot of information about the vertical structure of the hurricane. As we were talking about with vertical wind shear, is it tilting? Is it vertically stacked? And since the storm is about to become really intense, or already is really intense, it probably is vertically stacked. So, but the primary missions now are on center fixes. The Hurricane Center needs to know where that center is to get the most accurate representation of where the center of these storms are. That's what they're doing, Mike.
All right, so for folks that are watching in the chat here, now is your last chance to get some questions in before we wrap things up. We're, of course, going to be coming back at you live at right around 5 o'clock Eastern Standard Time. Of course, that's when we have the next big track update from the National Hurricane Center, where they narrow in that cone of uncertainty. It's called the cone of uncertainty for a reason, but now beginning to really hone things in, and we will start to see a really good idea where the best and brightest in tropical meteorology. I like to call them the Navy SEALs of tropical meteorology, that being the folks at the NHC. And Dr. David was one of those folks, and he's on our team. So he's one of the best and brightest. They are really beginning to narrow down that track, and we'll have a really good idea as to where Ian is headed as it approaches the west coast of the state. Someone was asking not too long ago, what's up with Brevard County and even as far north as Broward County? Well, I can tell you this. I've got the rain alerts turned on from the My Radar app, and I just got an alert about 10 minutes ago that we are looking at moderate to heavy rain arriving in about 10 minutes. So right outside right now, it's likely going to start pouring rain here in just a few moments. And looking at the app here, you can see a lot of heavy rain beginning to work its way northward. I believe I'm using now, the Tampa St. Pete radar station there. So West Palm Beach just getting dumped on by rain, and these are just the outer bands of Ian, mind you. Extending as far northward as Vero Beach and Sebastian, with some of those stronger range now approaching, again, Disney World. I feel real bad, David, for the folks that that maybe have been planning their big Disney trip, of course, during hurricane season, but, planning that big Disney trip and are getting caught at Epcot right now or something, or the Magic Kingdom, with a lot of heavy rain, and likely not going to be stopping at least until maybe even into the weekend and beyond. But we've got folks asking in the chat here. David, we'll probably wrap here on this in terms of the questions from folks. What can the east coast of Florida expect at this point? Of course, we've talked a lot about the west coast. Storm surge numbers are really off the charts there. Could potentially be one that meteorologists are studying for a long time afterward, particularly with how vulnerable that part of the continental shelf is. But on the eastern side, as we see Ian work its way northward along I-4, what can those folks anticipate here as the strongest winds begin to arrive into the next 24 to 36 hours?
Sure. So because Ian's wind field is so broad, there will be a storm surge, probably on the eastern coast of Florida, probably 1 to 3 feet, because since Ian is moving away from shore, not towards shore, you're not getting that pushing effect, that storm surge effect. The Carolinas might have to worry about that, but the eastern coast of Florida, the storm surge isn't going to be that big a deal. It's going to be primarily rain. There still is, because, like I said, because Ian's wind field is so large, there will be some, probably 1 to 3 feet, but that's not quite the big concern with this storm for people on the East Coast.
Okay. So I think, Dr. David, we're probably going to wrap things up here. It's always a blast getting to chat with you, and this is our first experience with having you live here in the studio breaking down a tropical cyclone and what could potentially be a rather historic one for Western Florida. So thank you so much for joining us. We will, of course, have Dr. David here throughout the rest of our afternoon. He'll be back with us at 5 o'clock Eastern Time. So if you did not have your question answered right now, you'll have the opportunity to ask him here in not too long. A couple of other updates for you. My Radar Storm Chaser Aaron Jajak is here in the Sunshine State driving the My Radar car. He is on his way south as we speak. Right now, he's got all of his gear. There's plenty of gas in the car. So we will have some live images from Aaron. We're hoping later this evening. But we want to make sure, of course, that Aaron, as well as meteorologist Matthew Capucci, are in a safe place. Because even though they are certainly experts in their field, of course, we want to be sure that they are in a safe place. So meteorologist Matthew Capucci is on the way south right now, along with Storm Chaser Aaron Jajak. Trying to think of what else here. Of course, a big shout out to our guys in the back. We've got Matt in the back pulling the strings. I don't know what we would do without the technical crew of My Radar. Any and all of the content that you see on the My Radar channel, whether it be the animations, the videos, these live streams, things in the studio, that's all because of the folks behind the scenes, the unsung heroes of the My Radar team. So big shout out to Matt, Damian, Jack. You guys are awesome. We've got Erica Lopez as well waiting in the wings, so there will be plenty of updates coming from Erica as we work our way through the afternoon, as well as bilingual updates from meteorologist Erica Lopez, as well as meteorologist Joseph Trujillo Falcon. So if you're not following us on the My Radar Espanol side of things, of course, we are everywhere nowadays. You can see the social media channels above my head: Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, as well as YouTube. We really appreciate it if you are watching on YouTube to like this video, click on that thumbs up button. It really helps us break through the algorithm and get this information to people people that really need to see it. Of course, subscribe to the channel if you are not already as well. Click on that notification bell as well. That way you'll always know whenever we drop a new video, or of course whenever we go live as well. And I'd be remiss to mention, if I didn't say, to download the My Radar app if you don't already have it. It's totally free, and a lot of the features that I've showed you today are included in the free version of the app. So much great stuff to keep you and yours safe as well. Go to hurricanestrong.org. Again, that's hurricanestrong.org. A big shout out to our partners at the Federal Alliance for Safe Homes, FLASH. They have a ton of great information there for preparing for hurricanes, what to do in the midst of a hurricane arriving on your front door, and then what to do afterward as well. Just because this storm is coming now doesn't mean this process ends when the storm is over top of you or just passes by. There's likely to be a lot of cleanup after the fact, and it's easy to get overwhelmed in the lead up to it, during it, and after it. So the folks at Flash have done a fantastic job in making that all super duper easy for you. Again, go to hurricanestrong.org, and there's plenty of checklists there. Again, I think that's going to do it. Big shout out to Dr. David Ryglicki, of course, meteorologist Matthew Capucci, Erica Lopez, and storm chaser Aaron Jajak are all standing by. We will have My Radar team coverage as Ian approaches the west coast of Florida. So again, from all of us here on the team, stay safe out there. We'll see you coming up in just a couple hours.